change and stress. And these are two very important things that we deal with in grief, in dealing with our own grief and in dealing with grief counseling. One of the things that is a reality is that grief is always the result of change. And we don't stop to think about that a lot of times. But again, as we've said from the very beginning, grief is based in relationship. And when we lose a relationship, that's when grief is there, or when we're anticipating the loss of a relationship. That's when we begin to suffer grief, anticipatory grief, regular grief, complicated grief. All of these situations are there. And that loss of that relationship is a change in role, a change in relationship, a change in attitude, a change in environment, all of these changes that occur for us. And one of the things that affects us in our grief is how well we handle change. So if we were sitting in a room together, one of the things I'd ask you is, how many of you really like change? How many of you embrace change? So Barry, are you a change lover, or are you somebody who be just as happy for things to stay the way they are?
My job has made me to be open and aware of change.
Yes. And Maureen, are you a change lover, or are you a let's stay things how they are?
Well, I don't live in the past anymore, and I realize that life is nothing but change, so I've accepted it.
Okay. That's, it's a reality, is that change is a reality for us. Hi, Veronica. Change is a reality, and change is always happening. Excuse me just a minute. I am going to sneeze here real quickly. Sorry about that. Change is a reality, and change happens to us. But change happens always when there is grief, and grief is the result of change. It's one of the things that happen. So let's talk about change. So what is change? Well, the page that Kevin has up and that you'll get is the action of change. And so what happens is we're in a normal state. Now, whatever that normal state is for an individual, or for a relationship, or for a group, it's normal. And normal is individual. Normal is based on culture. It's based on our place in life. It's based on our birth order. All of these things for us is what causes it to be normal. But it's our normal. One of the things that I often say to people is, if I ask you to do a real assessment of your early morning ablutions, getting up and getting ready for the day, if you stop and think about it, you do basically the same thing every day. Now, it may change on the weekend because you don't go to work, or because you have a special event coming up. But generally, we do things the same way. I get up every morning, I get around, I take the dog for a walk, I bring the dog back, give the dog food, I go out to Starbucks, I pick up the iced tea lemonade for my Deb, bring it back, put it beside her bed, put her snack there, so when she wakes up in the middle of her sleeping and she wants to have a little snack, she's got a little snack to make coffee. It's the same basic pattern every day. And we do that. And that's part of our normal. And it's our normal. And we're going along and everything is there. And then something happens. An action, event happens that becomes the change trigger. Now, that can be almost anything. In grief, it's often the loss of a loved one, the loss of a loved pet, some tragedy. It can also be the loss of a job, a good friend moves away, whatever it is, it's something that triggers the change. And in that change, we move into that change status. And you see in the picture, the guy is kind of falling into just emptiness there. And we find ourselves all of a sudden akimbo and awash in this vacuum, or it's like falling into the ocean. If you're sailing along and all of a sudden you're swept overboard, middle of the ocean, you're there in the middle of the ocean and you're floundering because you don't have anything to stand on. You don't have anything that's solid. And so part of the thing that we're looking for in change is we have to move through it, and we're floundering around, we're looking, and we're trying to find some place to put a foot down to start to begin to build a new solid base. And as we do that and we build that and we put it together, we come to a new normal state. Now, this normal state is different than the state that fell apart. It's different than the state we lost, but it is our new normal. It is the new normal for us, and this is how we begin to function. And so we find ourselves then reestablished. But in that process, we are suffering stress. Stress is a thing that always comes with change. Now, some people say, well, I never get stressed. Well, that's not a true statement. They may handle stress well. They may not experience stress overload very often, but we all have stress because stress is a part of adapting to the new change, to this reality. And in grief, we are experiencing stress, the stress of the loss, the stress of role loss, and this whole change to us and for ourselves that we're beginning to experience. The depth of how hard it hits us has a lot to do with how well we handle change and how much we like change. Now, I'm one of those people that struggles more with same old, same old. For me, change, things changing, and even rapid change tends to be the things I like. Now, I'm married to an individual who doesn't mind things changing, but she wants them to change slowly, wants to prepare for them, and she would prefer to have them pretty much in a stable, steady state. And we all are different things, and some people don't like change at all, and they really struggle with any change. And for them, that can really amplify the emotions and the challenges they're having in dealing with grief. So in grief work, one of the things we often do is we often have people look at their change spectrum. Where are they on the change spectrum? Because it can help them to understand, well, this person doesn't seem to be having this big a thing, this big of a problem, and I'm having more of it. In the family, why are these things? Well, again, as we always say, everybody grieves differently. But how we manage change, how we experience change, how we feel about change has a direct impact on our grief and our grief process because it has to do with the stress that comes with the change. Now, one of the things that we want to look at is in looking at grief and looking at change, do we see it as a catastrophe? So Kevin, if we're going down to the next slide, and again, that is part of how we see things changing. Do we see it as a catastrophe or do we see it as an opportunity? Now you see on this form, and I'm going to read a little bit of it for you. Cognitive distortions are irrational thoughts that have the power to influence how you feel. Excuse me. Everyone has some cognitive distortions. They're a normal part of being human. However, when cognitive distortions are too plentiful or extreme, they can be harmful. One common type of cognitive distortion is called catastrophizing. When catastrophizing, the importance of a program is exaggerated, or the worst possible outcome is assumed to be true. By learning to question your own thoughts, you can correct many of these cognitive distortions. So what happens is we get these things and they come to us and they can just throw us there. And what we can do is immediately can go to the worst possible thing that could happen to us. And in grief, that is often where we go. We often find ourselves in this loss and this state of, I'll never be the same. I'll never be happy again. I would never, you hear people say that. And it's the way they're feeling at the moment. And that's not wrong, but that can prevent the health and growth and healing that we need to move through and to be where we need to be and make things happen. Now, before I go too much further, let me stop and ask, are there any questions about change and stress?
Well, Murray, can I share something with you?
We've got an echo going there.
Yeah, I hear that. Can I share something with you?
Sure. Go ahead, Maureen.
I don't know why the echo. Well, all right, I'll get off. It's very distant. Can you hear me all right now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. It's fine.
All right. So as you know, I'm going through, my husband died 3 months ago. And I've really been working very seriously on getting out of the harmful thoughts of past. And I woke up, I had a dream. I had a dream last week, and it really helped me. I think there was a lot said in it, and I don't normally dream. There was a cross on the ground about 15 feet long, and I was standing on it above the crossbar. So I was about 3/4 of the way up, and I was dressed all in black. And in front, and I had been, before I went to bed that night, I said, I really have to stop all this negative thinking. I have to get past that and see all the good things. And my dream showed me 3/4 of the way up the cross, there was the white light at the top that was leading me through. So I believe it was a very positive dream, telling me not to give up. And I was also very happy that I've come as far as I have, but I've been spiritually working on it. I really have. So
Good. Wonderful.
Great deal of hope.
Good. Well, that's one of the things that this form and that we use this thing so that we begin to have hope, begin to see things. So let's look at this form. So the first box is, what are you worried about? Because a catastrophe always causes us to be worried. Am I going to have enough of this? Am I going to be able to get the resources? Am I going to be able to am I ever going to be this happy again? Am I ever going to be healthy again? So we have the person fill out, what are you worried about? And they may have a number of things in there. But then we begin to focus down on it. So that how likely is that your worry will come true? See, that's one of the things we want to help people when they're struggling in their grief with this hopelessness, with this loss, with this, it's such a catastrophe, I'll never get well, I'll never feel healthy, I never will have a good relationship, I won't find anybody who loves me as much as that person did. All of these kind of things that can be there. So then we say to them, how likely is it? How likely is it that you'll never find anybody else who loves you? How likely is it that you'll never be able to laugh again? And so we give examples of past experiences and other evidence to support your answer. So again, you've had other tragedies, you've had other brokenness in your life, you've had other things that happen. Take a look at them. Have you never been able to get past them? That helps people to say, well, you know what? If I was able to get past that, good chance I'll be able to get past this. If your worry does come true, what's the worst that could happen? See, that's the next thing, is because when we begin to see our loss and in our grief, it becomes a catastrophe for us. One of the things we want to say was, okay, if the worst of this happened, what would be the results? What would be the results? And so as you begin to unpack it, you begin to get a sense and begins to take control of it rather than it taking control of you. And then we go down to the next one. If your worry does, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don, down to the next one. If your worry does happen, what's most likely to happen? And then at the bottom here, if your worry comes true, what are the chances you'll be okay? In 1 week, in 1 month, in 1 year? So again, this is another stepping thing to help people look at it and say, okay, so if the worst does happen, in a week, what's the chance I'll be all right? In a month, in a year? Because what that does is it's not worried so much about them getting exact right percentages. And some people might say, well, I don't know no, just in your gut feeling, what's the percentage? Because we're not really looking at the percentage. What we're doing is walking the person to say, in time, in steps, in periods, moving forward, when do you think, how do you feel like? And you begin to see that as I move forward, things do change, things do become easier, things do become more manageable. I get a better handle on these things. And so I begin to see that. And so even if the worst happens, even if the worst that I imagine happens, I'm going to be all right at some point. I'm going to be able to manage it. And that's the other key, is I'm going to be able to manage it. I'm going to be able to handle it. I'm not going to be totally wiped out and never have it. Because that kind of thinking leads to hopelessness. And hopelessness can become a destructive force in our life. So we want to help the person who's feeling this and seeing it this way to move towards holding on to hope. You know, hope is that feathered thing that sings in our heart and causes us to keep going. Any thoughts or questions on that form or any of that before we move back up here and begin to talk more about stress and what stress does to us? All right, Kevin, let's go back up to where we start talking about stress here, all the way up to the top. So stress. Stress is a reality of life. We all experience stress. Go on up, Kevin, to the further on up. Go ahead. You go on one more. Still one more up. There we go. Okay, so we're going to set right here. So we're going to talk about stress. Stress, and let me read you. Stress is a normal mental and physical state that's triggered by circumstances that are not ideal. Everyone's bodies portray stress symptoms from external signs, such as facial acne. A lot of people don't realize that stress, especially stress overload, can cause people to have blemishes in their skin, to internal signs such as chronic diseases. When stress is left unmanaged, it can trigger a number of signs and symptoms. We all experience stress. Stress is a normal part of life. And our stress meter goes up and down according to what's happening in our life. If we're working, we have days where we have deadlines. Deadlines cause us to feel stress. We have a new boss causes us. In grief, we have all kinds of stressors. We've lost a relationship. We don't know where this is going to be. We're not sure how all of this change that puts us in this uncertain state. And in uncertain states, we feel more stress because we can tend to get afraid, can tend to not know. It's the in-betweenness that causes us difficulty for the most part. When we know where we're at, and that's one of the problems in the change. We have the normal, and then we have the thing that triggers it, and then we're in this in-between state where it's neither fish nor fowl, as they say, and we don't know what we are, we don't know where we are, we don't know what the relationship is, until we get to that new solid state. And in that is when we begin to have stress, and we begin to feel stress. As I say, stress is a normal thing. Stress is a physical manifestation of when we're feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope with life's demands. Now, in grief, that's a regular thing that happens to people because, again, we're thrown into this turmoil. And they can be caused by all sorts of things. And when we begin to feel stressed, we generally fall into the same things of the fight, flight, or balkanize, where we want to run away, or we get angry, we're going to attack, and we're going to fight this whole thing, or we kind of fortressize ourselves and shut out and shut ourselves down. And so what we want to do is first of all, admit that we're feeling stress. Now, the problem isn't stress, the problem is stress overload. As I've talked about in these things before, it's like the pressure cooker. Pressure cookers are wonderful things for preparing meals. And if you're doing osso buco, it's a great place to throw all the stuff in there, put it on and let it cook, and it does a wonderful job. But if the pressure valve isn't working and is defective and it builds up too much pressure, then it explodes. Well, stress overload is the problem for us. If we're not managing the stress and it continues to build, and what grief does is it puts stress into our normal stress level. And for some of us, we don't feel as stressed about normal everyday things as some people do. And again, it's a personality. It has to do with our own biorhythms. It has to do with our own hormones and our cultural states and all of these other things. It's very much a part of how we manage stress and how it works for us. And so we begin in grief, though, to have this additional stress. And if we don't manage the stress, we find ourselves moving into stress overload. And stress overload is one of the things that can cause people severe problems that inhibit their ability to manage the grief, to grow through the grief, and to become healthy. It can also end up being devastating on an emotional, social, spiritual, and physical level. And so we want to be aware of some of the signs of stress overload and how we do those things. So stress overload can result in a number of things. It can lead to anxiety and even panic attacks. Now, if you've ever experienced a panic attack, or if you've known people who have, it's a horrendous thing, because all of a sudden you're just in a state of total panic and you don't even necessarily know what's caused it. And a lot of times it can happen from stress overload. A feeling of being constantly pressured, hassled, and harried. One of the things that can happen in grief work that can lead to stress overload is this feeling pressured to be what people think I ought to be, pressured to do grief the way other people think I should, pressured to move through this grief and be better, as opposed to taking it one step at a time, as opposed to doing grief in your own way. Feeling pressured to participate in things that you're not ready to participate in again, that you're not ready to. This is one thing that can happen, especially in the area of holidays and dealing with holidays and special events. We can feel pressured to handle those in a way that we used to, or a special way, or something that people expect of us. And that can build up pressure that can lead to additional stress and can begin to cause us to struggle and to have issues. Can lead to irritability and moodiness. When we become stress overloaded, we don't handle things as well as we did. We can find ourselves withdrawing. We can find ourselves on an emotional swing that's even more than what might even be normal for us. We can find ourselves being irritable over things that normally wouldn't cause us a problem. I use the example of people, who come in and people that normally say hello to you and they laugh and they joke, and you suddenly find that irritating. Or they say something to you that normally you wouldn't even think about, and you find yourself irritated with it. It can be as a result of stress overload. Physical symptoms. Now, this is one that a lot of times people don't stop to think about. Stomach aches, stomach problems, headaches, chest pains. A lot of times people can feel themselves starting to have chest pains and starting to feel tightness in their muscles and tenseness, that achiness that you can have. And it can be caused from stress overload. We don't think about the fact that stress and stress overload can cause us to be physically tired, to be exhausted, to actually find ourselves with muscle aches and pains that we don't understand where they're coming from. If I was out building a brick wall, I'd expect to be achy the next day. But if I wake up and I've got this change going on and these things, and all of a sudden I feel like I've got muscle pains in that, and what did I do? What's happened to it? It can be the result of stress overload. People can then have allergic reactions. They can find themselves having asthmatic type of conditions that they've never had. And if a person happens to have breathing difficulties, asthma, emphysema, COPD, these sort of things, stress overload will generally cause that to be even worse than it was. And medication that they may be doing is not being effective. And that stress can be directly tied to their grief. And if you're in a heavy grief situation and you find yourself with these things, it can be because you're not managing the stress that you're going through in this time of change and loss. People will find themselves sleepless, having difficulty sleeping. Very common thing. In grief, severe grief, a lot of times people will either sleep too much or they won't be able to sleep at all. And they will find themselves in stressful situations. People find themselves unable to sleep or stay asleep. And that can lead to other physical, emotional, social difficulties as well. People will find themselves in overstressed situations beginning to self-medicate. And we think of self-medication often as drugs, alcohol, but it can also be food. It can also be sexual relationships. It can be any number of things that we're using to try to mask this tenseness, this stress, this tightness that we feel in our spirit and in our hearts and minds. It can also lead to great sadness. We can end up with really great sadness. Before I talk about some of the things that we can do manage our stress, I do want to talk a little bit more about that. We can have vasovagal problems. Our blood temperature, our blood pressure. There was in the late 60s and early 70s, probably even more in the 70s, early to mid 70s, there was a lot of emphasis on stress and stress management. And some of you may be old enough, like I am, to remember when we were doing that. And actually, we had little stress meters that people would wear on their finger and would change colors. If you remember the mood rings and mood stones, they changed color. The reason they changed color was the change in our body temperature, which is a direct result of stress. And so the colors would become these darker colors as opposed to the lighter colors, the more stress we had. And it became a very big subject of managing stress, looking to handle stress, because people were experiencing more and more uncontrolled stress. So you can begin to have problems. Your blood pressure will generally go up under extreme stress and heavy stress. You begin to feel those kind of problems. Stress overload can lead to lowering your immunity and your immune system. And people can find themselves in an extended state of stress overload, coming up with a lot of illness, a lot of colds, a lot of flu, a lot of other kinds of illness that they generally say, I don't usually have a problem with this. I'm not somebody who's had this. It can be a result of your immune system being lowered. And especially right now in this age of COVID, we're all concerned about our immune systems and staying healthy. But it is another one of those. Stress overload can also affect our ability to digest our meals. And it can impact our ability to manage dealing with our food and how we normally digest and how that wears. So we can end up with digestion problems. We can end up with stomach problems. We can end up with ulcers because of this stress. So again, I'm hitting a lot of things, but one of the things that we don't often work with people on is managing their stress in times of extreme grief because of that. As I said early on, acne. People who are suffering extreme stress and extreme stress overload can find themselves all of a sudden again having problems with skin breakout that they haven't had since they were a teenager. You can leave it, yeah, right there, Kevin, with what we can do. We're going to get to that in a minute. They can find themselves all of a sudden having these problems again that they haven't had for years. Well, why? It can very, very much be a part of stress, because stress overload impacts our hormone systems and our lymph nodes and our lymph systems and all of those things that tend to process impurities in our bodies. Headaches. Again, a lot of times headaches are caused by vascular work and cause us to become tense, which can ratchet down our vessels. A lot of people misunderstand where headaches and especially migraines come from. They think that the migraines are when the stress, when it shuts the vessels down. It's not. Migraines are the result of all of a sudden them opening up too quickly. And so we can do something and we can find ourselves all of a sudden with it opening up, our veins opening up too quickly, and we get this burst of blood into our brain. It can cause us headaches. Stress overload can cause headaches. And if you start finding yourself having a lot of headaches and you don't seem to know why, it's time to do a stress check, a stress management check, and find out where you're at, because it could well be that you've had this buildup. We can find ourselves craving things that aren't necessarily the best for us to eat, and it can impact our diet, and which can impact all sorts of other physical and things for us. Stress overload can really impact one's libido and can cause difficulties in our intimate relationships, for an intimate relationship, because we have this decrease of our own libido and our own desires. Again, I spoke about muscle tension, and this is one we don't often think about when we're managing stress and thinking about stress overload, is that we can find ourselves with muscle tension, aches, muscle aches, and tightness in our muscles that we don't normally have. Now, some of us have to work hard at trying to be limber and stay loose, but for some people, that can all of a sudden change, and they can find themselves with real muscle tightness and muscle tension. A lot of it up and through our neck and our shoulders, where a lot of people carry their tension and their stress. I happen to be one person where my trapezius doesn't work for me, but I carry my stress in my chest. And I can tell when I'm feeling stress, when I'm feeling stressed, because I get a tightness through my chest. Now, a few years ago, that scared me. Went through the whole thing of testing and everything else, found out no problem with my heart. It's simply that I carry my stress in my chest. So I realized, well, for me, one of the things, knowing when I'm becoming stressed, when I'm getting to stress overload, is I start to get this tension in my chest. And I then can take the steps to begin looking and saying, okay, why am I stressing? What's causing this? And begin to work it through. So understanding some of these symptoms, understanding how these things can impact us, then allows us to be aware. And when we are aware, then we can start looking at ways that we can manage this stress. Some of the ways that you have on the list that Kevin has up for us now. On a daily basis, we can do things like take sufficient time off from work or from whatever else we're doing that's handling that. One of the things in grief, especially in the early days of grief, a lot of times people say, well, I'm just going to get back to doing what I was doing. Well, that may not always be the best thing. We maybe need to take time to feel what we're feeling, to work it through, to allow that, to maybe take time off from work, to take time off from other activities that we have that cause us to not be able to manage the stress that we're eating. Make sure that we eat as well as we can. When you're working with people, ask them, check with them. Are you eating? What are you eating? When are you eating? How are you eating? One of the things that we need to always remember is that the body is a machine, and the machine needs energy, and it gets its energy through what we consume. So we want to help them to make sure that they're eating well, eating healthy, and managing to give their body the fuel that they need to function. Drink lots of water. One of the things that water does is helps to flush our system. And as we said, stress impacts our hormones, it impacts our regulatory systems, it impacts the lymph system. And so drinking water helps us to stay hydrated, which is good for us. It helps us to move things through our system. Taking time to rest, to download, to just stop, to rest. A good thing to do is to move, and again, depending upon your own physical condition, depending upon their physical condition, what kind of movement can they do? Now, this can be a challenge for people who have mobility issues. And so what we need to help them to work at, and one of the things to do is to really assess what is the mobility issue, your issue, or the mobility abilities, the mobility possibilities that you have or the individual you're working with has. And then within that range, what can they do to make sure that they're moving regularly? And so that they keep going and they keep burning off some of this stress. Getting a massage. If you're somebody who doesn't mind having somebody else manipulating portions of your body, getting a massage can help to break up some of the tension and help us to relax. Listening to music. And it doesn't have to be listening to the sound of the ocean and listening to Zen zither. If that works for you, that's great. For some people, relaxing, listening to music that's lively, that's uplifting, that can be the kind of music, but music that works for you. Simplifying your schedule. One of the things to say to people who are dealing with grief is to look and say, how complicated is your schedule? Right now, you're dealing with this. You're dealing with this change. You're dealing with these stressors. You're dealing with all this. What can you do to lessen that? To lighten your load, if you will? cut activities that take up time and energy. If you can do away, when you've got the energy managing change, are there things that are energy consumers that you can push off or you can let go for a while? For people who are spiritual, prayer, meditation, guided imagery is another great way to relax, to dissipate the stress. And talking to a professional. Sometimes we just really need to talk to somebody who's a good listener. I've shared, I'm sure, in these other things because I share it regularly, David Augsburger's quote, "The feeling of truly being listened to is so akin to being loved that most of us can't tell the difference." Somebody who really listens and being able just to hear what we say and for us to get out what we're saying and get out that talking it out can sometimes really relieve the pressure and the stress. So it is, go ahead on down, Kevin. This material, yes, Veronica.
Are there certain questions that you could kind of guide us to helping them find their own ways of coping? Like, for instance, what kind of things they like, what kind of music they like? Because a lot of times when they're in grief, they don't know what they want or need or anything. So what would you recommend? And you could answer this question in the end so I don't, divert the presentation, but just to help them, guide them to what will help them to de-stress best for
Okay, great.
their personal preferences.
Yeah, they're great. And there are tools online, and if you send me an email, I will send you a couple of other things that we use in our own work. Our stress tests. There are a couple of things that we have that allow people then to measure the amount of stress they have. But good questions to ask. Some of the good questions to ask. One of the best questions is, can you think of something that in the past has caused you to feel really good?
Okay.
So that's one. Something in your past that's caused you to feel really good. Is that something that has regularly been something that made you feel good? What have you done in your past that's caused you just to feel really relaxed? And for different people, that's a different thing. For some people, laying in a hammock, listening to the wind blow is really relaxing. For some people, going for a 5-mile run is relaxing. So get them to think about, ask them, what kind of things have caused you to feel really relaxed?
Okay.
One of the other things that you can do is say, I want you to close your eyes right now and imagine the most peaceful, calming, relaxing place you can imagine. And then have them tell you about that. And then remind them that when they begin to feel that, if they can stop and do that. One of the other things to present to them, and we've given you the material before, is my STLC, stop, think, listen, communicate. So you can help them to use that as a tool to say, okay, let's stop for a minute. Let's think about the stress you've been feeling. Let's think about the things that are causing you to feel stressed. Now let's listen to your body. What happens when that? And what do you hear? What do you feel? What do you experience? And now, how can you tell yourself, how can you talk to yourself about how to let go of some of that or what to do with it? Help, Veronica? That makes sense to you?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No, that's all right. It's a great question. But those are good questions. And so those sort of questions, but always start with them beginning to recall, helping them to recall times and things that cause them to feel relaxed, to feel calm, to dissipate that. Or another question is, can you think of a time that you were really feeling uptight and stressed and something happened that caused you to go, what was that? Because that's another thing that helps them to reflect back to a time and say, well, all of a sudden I saw a butterfly and I got distracted by the butterfly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on YouTube, you can bring up pictures of butterflies flying around. And that might be a tool to suggest to them. So that sort of thing here. The picture that Kevin just brought up is managing change and stress is another sheet that we have for you that talks about that. Go ahead on, scroll on down, Kevin. And it's got some good materials in it. And it's to pay. So one of the things that happens is this little picture of stress, you know, and some of the key questions that you can ask to determine preventative stress includes, what are you afraid of? What supports a fear culture? Are people afraid to bring up unsafe, healthy conditions? Are people afraid to report incidents? How does he or she react in their culture? And how does fear affect delivery and service? These are also questions you can ask. Saying to somebody, again, another good question, reflecting back on Veronica's asking us. Question is, how is stress viewed in your culture? The culture of your ethnicity, the culture of your family, the culture of your workplace. There are places where stress in a company can be presented as a good thing because it drives people and makes them stay in there and busy. There are other companies that say, let's have our people relaxed and not feeling stressed and not feeling uncertain. So you begin to ask the question is, how does stress seen in your culture? How do you understand it? And that helps people then to begin to look at it. So let's go on down, I think, going down to the next slide, Kevin. So here are some, these are also things that you just there that are also behaviors that you can see. We've talked about most of them and how stress can be that. Go on down to the next one, Kevin. And these are all materials that you have in the packet that you'll get and are very helpful for you in working with folks. This one is another one on change. Again, change and changes. And it talks about basically employees, but the same thing helps with people. Helping them to understand that they are in a state of change and that change does bring stress and change brings instability and change can bring fear. Change can also be exciting for them. And in grief, sometimes people will say, well, I usually like change. I find change exciting, but right now I just don't know. That's where going with the decatastrophizing. I'll get my term. Going with the decatastrophizing sheet can help them to say, okay, why is this change scaring me? What is it about it? Because normally I like change. I love change. But right now, I don't want to change. Well, they probably don't want to change because they've just lost a relationship that's been vitally important. Someone they've loved, been in a relationship. So they can begin to look at, so you can help them to look at that. But again, this change is so important as a part of it. Go on down to the next one, Kev. Okay, that's pretty much, I guess this is, we just stop right there. We're going to stop. This is where we started with this action of change. Remember, helping folks to understand in grief that they are experiencing a substantive change, a powerful change. They're going from one normal state, the way things are, the way they've been comfortable, the way they felt. This loss has been the trigger that's changed that. And now they find themselves at a loss in this empty space, this floundering around. And that's okay. That's normal. That's your normality at this point. It's not one that you probably like. So we're going to begin working through finding a new stability for you, a new platform that will become your new normal. And it may feel very strange and very different than your old normal. But if it's a normal that works for you and is healthy for you, that's a great normal. Any questions that we have at this point? We're coming up towards the end here. So Kenya, if you want to go ahead and stop recording, and then we'll just take any questions and we'll just have a little dialogue for anybody that wants to throw anything for